Well, today I'd like to speak to you for a little while about coping with criticism. Coping with criticism as we continue our series on how to handle what's handling you. Maybe you have been criticized from time to time, and I want to give you a few pointers on how you can better handle criticism when it comes your way. Because it is going to come your way if you ever try to accomplish anything worthwhile in your life. There was a man once who was tarred and feathered and run out of town on a rail. And as they were carrying him through the streets on a pole, he said to one of the men, "If it weren't for the glory of the whole thing, I'd just as soon pass this up." And I think that is sometimes how we feel when it comes to criticism. If it weren't for the attention and the notoriety we get out of it, I think we'd just as soon pass criticism by as well, because it does come to us every now and then, especially if we're trying to do something and if we're trying to accomplish anything in our lives. One of the hardest things to take and one of the easiest things to give is criticism. And as for me, I don't know why people ride me the way they do, because I actually only have three faults: what I think, what I say, and what I do. And yet I get criticized. The trouble with most of us is that we would rather be ruined by praise than saved by criticism. And yet, if I read my Bible right, if no one has anything to ever say against us, then our Christianity is not worth much. Because Jesus says this in Luke 6 and verse 26. Jesus warned us that we will be criticized. That's right. He warned us that there will be times when people say bad things about us. He puts it this way. He says, "Woe to you when all men speak well of you." Think of that. Woe to you. In other words, that's like saying, bad things are going to happen to you. Bad things are true of you if everybody is saying good things about you. Because everybody can't always say good things about you, because they all can't be true. Sometimes people are going to be saying bad things about you. Now that's true. In other words, you're going to be criticized. So it just stands to reason that we as God's people need to know how we can deal with criticism when it does come our way. Now, we can be criticized by our co-workers. We can be criticized by our brothers and sisters in the church. We can be criticized by our kids, or even by our parents, by our brothers and sisters in our family. We can be criticized by just about anybody. And we don't always do so well when it comes to handling those moments when we are criticized. As a matter of fact, I think sometimes we do a pretty poor job of it. But I do take courage in the fact that the Bible tells us that there's a good way to handle criticism. There's a proper way to handle criticism, a very helpful way and a beneficial way that we can deal with criticism. So that's what we want to give our attention to. Now, in the first place, let's just accept the reality of criticism. Let's talk about the reality of criticism first, because, we have to recognize criticism as a fact of life. It is a real fact of life. And when I read my Bible, I understand that some of the best of God's servants were not able to escape criticism. President Harry Truman once said, "If you can't stand the heat, just get out of the kitchen." Well, some of God's best servants could not escape the heat of criticism. I mean, you look at some of the ones that were put in God's showcase, so to speak. Some of the best servants of God. You take Moses, you take Elijah, you take David, man after God's own heart, Nehemiah, Jesus even, and his apostles. Was there ever a time in these men's lives, you just think about any of these guys. Were these guys immune to criticism? Were these men exempt from that? Not a one of them. I could show you in every one of these guys' lives where they were criticized by somebody at some time. You take Moses. Why, you look at the time when Moses led his people out of Egyptian bondage after those 430 some odd years they were down there in Egypt, and here he was leading them through the wilderness on the way to the promised land. Exodus chapter 15, verse 24, for example, says, the people murmured against Moses, saying, what shall we drink? Here they were complaining like little babies. Wah, wah, Moses, give us something to drink, we're thirsty. The people murmured, they complained constantly against Moses. And then a little bit later on in chapter 16 of Exodus, the whole congregation murmured against Moses and Aaron, his brother, in the wilderness. And they said to Moses, you brought us forth into this wilderness to kill us, the whole congregation, with hunger. So they wanted something to drink, they wanted something to eat, and they were constantly grumbling and murmuring against Moses. So here was Moses between that proverbial rock and a hard place. He was wanting to do what God had called him to do, and yet he was trying to please the people at the same time, and no wonder he was so frustrated. Tim LaHaye calls Moses the melancholy man because he was given to bouts of depression, frustration, even anger, losing his temper at times. I can relate to a guy like that. And Moses himself in Exodus 17 and verse 4 says, what am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me. You know, Moses wasn't winning any awards with his own people, was he? They were almost to the point of killing their own leader. How about Nehemiah? Nehemiah, there's a good one. But wait a minute. No, he was also the target of vicious criticism as well, wasn't he? You see, the enemies of God's people hated the Jews, and let's see. You know, we hear a lot of talk these days about the notion of building a wall, don't we? People make fun of that. Well, that wasn't original to our day and time. Nehemiah himself was building a wall. And yes, it was to protect his people. And others made fun of him. They protested the notion of building some wall. And his enemies said, hey, even if a fox were to come up, a fox could knock it over. But what did Nehemiah do? Did he say, okay, I'll change my mind. I won't build a wall. There are too many people that are talking against that. I won't do it. No. He stood firm. Even his own people became discouraged and said, we can't do that, Nehemiah. No, instead, Nehemiah refused to be intimidated. He stood fast. He stood firm. He refused to be distracted by the ridicule of his enemies. And when his enemies wrote Nehemiah a letter protesting that wall, that big, high, thick wall, requesting a meeting to discuss their objections, you know what his response was? Nehemiah 4, verses 3 and 9, basically what he tells them, I'm doing an important work. I don't have time to listen to your gripes. And he finishes the wall. The wall is built in 52 days. And that wall serves to protect God's own people. That was God's idea. Jesus, even he was criticized, wasn't he? And you know what? People didn't like Jesus himself. You know, a lot of times people get the idea that we ought to be more Christ-like. And I remind them, what did this world do to Jesus? I rest my case. You see, people get this notion that we ought to be more like loving Jesus, meek and mild, and never offend anybody. But they forget that the world hated Jesus to the extent that they were willing to put him on a cross and put him out of the way. Even when Jesus healed a man who was paralyzed in Luke chapter 5 and verse 30, the Jewish religious leaders accused him of blasphemy. So you can take any one of these men or any group of men, the apostles themselves, and you know, you have to conclude that they were all much like Rodney Dangerfield. They never got any respect. Yes, the best of God's servants were often the targets of criticism. And that just leads us to this conclusion. The only way to avoid criticism, my friend, is to say nothing do nothing, and be nothing. But the moment you try to step out by faith and accomplish anything worthwhile and meaningful for the kingdom of God, don't be surprised if you encounter some criticism. Yes, you'd better have the hide of a rhinoceros if you're going to involve yourself in any kind of meaningful ministry for the Lord. Because if you're going to be on the front lines of the battle, people will be taking shots at you. Amen? All right. So, well, maybe we need to look at another thing here. Let me just give you a couple of facts here about criticism. You know, there are some things that we need to recognize. There's a definition that I want to pass along to you when it comes to criticism. Merriam-Webster gives us this definition. The act of expressing disapproval or of noting the problems or faults of a person or thing. Here's another one. To judge as a critic, to find fault or blame or condemn. Now, the word criticism comes from the Greek base crit, which means to judge. All right? Now, when you're judging something, that can be neutral. Mark that down. To criticize, that can simply be a neutral thing. Now, although a lot of people consider criticism as purely a negative thing, that of tearing someone down when they think of this word, it's not always a negative thing. It can include building someone up as well. So, we got to understand that not all criticism is meant to defame or degrade or destroy. We're going through the book of 1 Corinthians in our Wednesday night study, and we see that the Apostle Paul offers a great deal of criticism to those brethren at Corinth. But not all of his criticism is negative, intended to tear down those brethren. It might seem to be putting them down, but he is speaking the truth in love. He is intending to build them up, but he is offering some harsh criticism to them nonetheless. But here's something we have to recognize. There are three facts, basically, about criticism I want to share with you. Many times, criticism comes when we least deserve it. Have you ever noticed that? It seems that when we're most in need of affirmation and we want somebody to put our arm around us and say, I really appreciate what you're doing. I know you're working hard at what you try to do. And, well, that's the time when somebody comes up and just blindsides you with some critical comment. It never seems to fail. Some of you women know that on the days when your kids are giving you fits, and it's been a hard day all the way around, and you feel all frizzy and frumpy, by the end of the day, that's when the husband comes home and he says, you know, honey, I think you're putting a little weight on around the middle, aren't you? Just what you needed to hear, isn't it? Well, when we need that word of encouragement, we needed criticism about like a drowning man needed a drink of water. Or you men know that maybe when you're having a hard day at the job, the boss comes, and that's the day he chooses to rake you across the coals for something you've done. Or maybe at church. Something needs to get done, and you ask who's willing to do it. No hands go up. You ask individually, and nobody is willing to volunteer to do it. And so what do? You throw yourself into doing it, only to get wind of grumbling through the grapevine, and you feel like chucking the whole thing. The list of examples is endless. We've all been there. The very time that we need the most support and affirmation, that's the time when we don't get it. And criticism, well, it seems to come when we least deserve it. It never seems to fail. Well, let me tell you something else. Criticism sometimes comes from those least qualified to give it. That's right. People who just don't understand us, who haven't been where we've been. You know, We're the ones in the arena. They're the ones in the grandstands, and it's a very different game altogether. People who haven't struggled with the things we're struggling with, they're throwing rocks from afar. They're blaming us for things that we're trying our very best to achieve. They're not the ones who are qualified to speak. I heard about a woman who was having trouble getting her car started after it had stalled in the middle of traffic, and the guy in the car behind her insisted on showing his impatience by blowing his horn every 5 to 10 seconds. Well, finally, the lady, who was worn out by that man's rudeness, thoughtlessness, stepped out of her car. She walked back to the honker's car and said, "Sir, I'm having a little trouble starting my car, and I'll tell you what, if you'll try to start my car for me, I'll stay back here and I'll honk your horn for you. How about that?" You know, there are a lot of people in church that do a lot more honking than helping. There are a lot more talkers than workers. There's a lot more criticism than labor. And the ones who do the most honking generally are the ones who do the least working. They may have never preached a sermon, may have never tried to preach a sermon. They may have never led a song or led a prayer. They may have never served as an elder, but they know exactly how it should be done. They're like the chronic objector who was asked for his suggestions on a project being discussed in a church board meeting, and he said, "Well, you go ahead and you make the plans, and I'll tell you what's wrong with them." Every baseball team could use a man who plays every position perfectly, who fields every ball perfectly, who hits every pitch just perfectly. But there's no way to get him to put down his hot dog and beer and come out of the grandstands. It's a whole lot easier to talk a perfect game than it is to play one. Amen? Well, criticism, it usually comes in ways that are least helpful. Criticism is a whole lot easier than constructive solutions. I don't know who it was that said, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words may never hurt me." Whoever it was must have been hearing impaired, because words can and do hurt. It would be nice if all criticism were constructive and done in a very gracious way, but generally that's not the way criticism comes. Once there was a man, a boy, and a donkey who were walking down a dusty road on the hot, sultry summer day. Someone passing by found fault with those two and made this comment: "Look at those two foolish boys, those men, that man and that boy, walking when they ought to be riding the donkey." Well, the man and the boy decided to ride the donkey. They had gone only a short distance when another fault finder shouted, "Look at that poor donkey carrying both of them. They're heartless. What a load on that donkey." Well, the son climbed down and walked alongside the father and the donkey. Another fault finder met them and said, "How can a man be so inconsiderate as to make a boy walk while he rides comfortably?" So the father and the boy exchanged places. Then someone else saw them and criticized their plan. "Look at that young man riding while the poor man has to walk in the heat of the day." The young man climbed down off the donkey, and determined to avoid any criticism, they tied the feet of the donkey to a pole and proceeded to carry the animal. And then all the passerby found fault. "Look at those crazy guys carrying that donkey." The moral of the story: criticism is inescapable. Sometimes, no matter what you try to do, people will find fault with whatever you do. So let's understand that criticism is a very real problem, and you can do your very best at what you try to accomplish, even if you're working for the Lord, and you will always be susceptible to somebody's fault finding. That's the reality. Well, what are some of the reasons that people criticize? Well, I've got to tell you, self-righteousness or pride, sometimes that heads the list. Remember in Luke chapter 18, Jesus told us a parable. he describes two men there. One was a Pharisee, the other was a publican or a tax collector. He describes these two men going up to the temple in the hour of prayer. And it was the Pharisee. Jesus says he prayed within himself as if God never heard that man's prayer. And the Pharisee was saying, God, I thank you that I'm not like the extortioner, the idolater, the adulterer, and even like this other tax collector over here. I'm thankful that you didn't make me like this guy over here. But then the humble tax collector didn't even have the courage to look up into heaven, but he said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. Jesus praised the tax collector and said, this man was so humble and so contrite. He was the one that was justified. The Pharisee was the one who belonged to that hawk-eyed group, Jesus says, who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and despised others. The Pharisee was so critical of that tax collector. And it was because of his own pride, his own self-righteousness, that he criticized his fellow man. Sometimes it's pride that causes us to look with disdain toward other people and think that we're so much better than they are. I guess the Pharisee's halo had dropped down across his eyes so that he could not see his own mistakes, his own sins. You know, the greatest of faults is to be conscious of none. And here was a guy who couldn't even see his own faults. And that's why Jesus says it was the tax collector who went down to his house justified and not the Pharisee. We need to make sure that we are humble enough to recognize our own faults. And if we're going to be pointing out sin and dirt in other people's lives, we need to make sure that our own fingernails are clean before we start pointing our fingers at somebody else. Well, how about this one? Jealousy. Envy. You know, a lot of times we start criticizing other people, and it's because we're just jealous of them. We're envious of them. They've done something worthwhile, and we don't want to give them any credit for it. We want to blow out their light. We want to blow out their candle to make our own look a little brighter. Envy is described as discontentment at the excellence or good fortune of others. Somebody has well said there'd be less fault-finding if all the fault-finders had to come from the ranks of the faultless. We somehow think that if we can blow out that other person's candle, that would make our own look brighter. Envy digs up the dirt that jealousy throws at success. And you know, if you're doing something worthwhile, if you're trying to accomplish something meaningful for the Lord, you don't be surprised if somebody starts to criticize you. But Jesus would want you to learn how to stand up to those put-downs. And He wants you to understand that much of the criticism that comes your way is nothing more than tribute that jealousy pays to accomplishment. If you're doing something good and you're getting the job done, people are going to criticize you. And it may just be because they're not willing to do what you're doing. It may just be that they're envious or jealous that you're stepping up and volunteering to do the work. Well, here's another reason why people criticize. And it's just downright ignorance. I have to be brutally honest. It's just people that don't have the facts. Oh, sometimes we might call that prejudice. You know what prejudice is, don't you? Prejudice is simply prejudging. Prejudice is what I call being down on something that you're not up on. Prejudice is condemnation without investigation. Prejudice is simply, it's a great time saver. It enables you to make your decision without bothering to get all the facts. Fault-finding has always been much easier than fact-finding. As a matter of fact, it can be a Christian's favorite indoor sport, prejudging people. It's a lot easier to be critical than to be correct. And even in the church, I hasten to say that a lot of brothers and sisters can be a lot like the old frontier judge who said in his court, "We've got to have order in this courtroom. There's so much noise in here that I've had to convict the last 5 men without hearing a word of testimony." It's dangerous to judge a situation when you don't know all the facts. And yet, how often do we do that? We criticize and we judge other people without knowing exactly what they're going through or what they had to get through in order to do what they're able to do. So easy to jump to a hasty conclusion. And oftentimes, more often than not, it's wrong. It's unjustified. Criticism. Oh, we need more affirming. We need more encouragement. And we need less criticism in the family of God. Amen? Well, let me just say also that sometimes it just comes from a critical spirit. You know, I mean, it's just a matter of being judgmental. And we all know what Jesus said about being judgmental, don't we? Matthew chapter 7 is that classical passage where he says, "Judge not, lest you be judged." Some people are just hypercritical. And people can be bent out of shape over the least little thing. You know, and I suppose that in a sense it shows us who is really controlling their lives. One passage that stands out in my mind when it comes to being critical is this one. In Revelation 12 and verse 10. Do you remember who it is that is called an accuser of our brethren? Do you remember? Who? Say it so people can hear you. Say it so you'll wake up a few of them. There you go, Satan, who is the accuser of our brethren. Revelation 12:10. And so when someone in the Lord's church is constantly carping and criticizing brothers and sisters, it shows you who is running their life. It's a very dangerous thing. Once after a preacher finished preaching his sermon, he was approached by a lady who was there to hear him preach. And she marched right up to him, right there as he was shaking the brethren out. And she said to him, "Preacher, your tie offends me." Now, I'm not wearing one. She said to him, and I'm not the preacher, but she said, "Preacher, your tie offends me. And you know what Jesus says about those things that offend?" She says, "You need to cut them off." So he said, "Well, so you expect me to just cut off my tie? Is that what you're..." She said, "Yes." He said, "Well, all right." And then he asked the brother to go get some scissors. So right there in front of that lady, he took the pair of scissors. He said, "Well, if that'll make you happy, ma'am." He cut his tie off. She said, "All right then." He said, "Well, now, ma'am, there's something I've been meaning to talk to you about." He said, he took those scissors. He said, "You know, your tongue offends me." And he handed those scissors to her. Yeah. You know, I think sometimes we get to the point where we criticize way too much. And it is so easy to fall into that rut of looking for all the bad things to talk about instead of looking for the good things to talk about. You know, the Bible in Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29 says that we're to let no corrupt communication proceed from our mouth, but only what is helpful, what is good, what is beneficial, that which edifies and builds up. And it's easy for us to fall into that wrong rut. And it takes a little extra thought to think about those things that we can discuss that affirms and encourages. But that's what the Lord expects of us. And let me also say in all fairness that there is some criticism that is designed to truly help. Okay? Let's just balance the scales here. Not all criticism is negative criticism. Not all criticism is destructive criticism. You know, I mean, there have been things in my life that people have said to me that have been aimed at helping me do a better job at things I've tried to do. I've played guitar. I've had some people point out certain things. I've played ball, baseball, football. I've been in sports. People have pointed out certain things aimed at helping me be a better athlete or ball player, things like that, better preacher, other things like that. I appreciated that. And you know, it's easy to give somebody the right to criticize you when you know they have the heart to help you. Not everybody does. Oh, I love this comment. It says, criticism, like rain, should be gentle enough to nourish a man's growth without destroying his roots. That's really good. That's good. And when criticism is given to help somebody, you shouldn't feel sensitive or hurt, because you know that they're giving that criticism to you to help you and to be better. If you have a baseball coach that's trying to help you on your swing, then take that. Don't get all defensive about it. Take it in the right spirit, because you know he's there to help you do better. If it's football, then listen to what people are trying to tell you so you'll be better at that. If it's a parent trying to help you play ball better, listen to them. If you know they love you, listen to what they're trying to say. They're just trying to help you do a better job at what is meaningful to you. Don't reject all that. Don't be too proud to listen to other people's advice. Well, let me make a few comments about this, and then we'll close. What about your response to criticism? I've made a couple of comments about that, but let me say that in the first place, if a mule kicks you in the teeth, what do? You consider the source, right? Yeah, that's right. So that's the first thing. I mean, you think, well, that's what they do, okay? Listen to Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 18. There are those who speak like the piercings of a sword, but the tongue of the wise heals. Now, there are just some people that don't know how to tell you anything in a graceful way. That's right. Anything they say is going to be just crass and brazen, and it is just rough around the edges. That's just the way they are. Okay, well, you just kind of chalk it up. That's just the way they speak. Consider the source. Was the critic sincere? Were they uninformed? Were they prejudiced? Malicious? Is it a puny, small-minded person who's just griping? Are they just trying to vent? Okay, well, let them have their moment. Or is it somebody you respect? Is it somebody who is generally a wise person? Is it somebody who seldom says anything, but usually says some pretty wise stuff? Well, then pay attention. Consider the source. Maybe the Lord is using that person to point out some things that are blind spots in your life. But if that criticism is just coming from some puny-minded chronic complainer, it might not be worth your time and effort to answer it. Let it go. A Christian foreman was the constant butt of some sneering remarks made by this abusive employee he had. And instead of reprimanding that employee, the foreman would take his insults very gracefully. He usually wouldn't say anything. He'd just let it go. All the other employees that he had they just sit back and just, how does this guy let this go? They couldn't understand it. This foreman once said, up our way, there's a dog that whenever the moon is full, he just sits there and barks all night long at the moon. And that's all he would say. The employees would wonder, what does he mean by that? One of his employees asked him one time, what about the dog in the moon, And smiling, the foreman would answer that question. The moon pays no mind. It just keeps right on shining. And then he said this, forbearance is the grace to keep on shining for the Lord amid the pack of howling dogs. It's pretty good. Sometimes you don't have to answer. Sometimes comments are so stupid, so ignorant, you don't have to give it the honor and the dignity of a response. Just let it go. Amen? Not every comment people make even deserves an answer. By the way, you ought to listen to what David says over in 2 Samuel chapter 16. I don't have time for that story. But David says to this critical man who is throwing rocks, coming out, cursing David, David just says, let the Lord deal with him. Let the Lord handle him. David goes on his way. Well, run a quick self-inventory if you've heard some criticism. In other words, could the guy be right? I mean, maybe he's right on. Do I have anything I need to change? Have I said something that's wrong? Have I gone too far I mean, maybe I have offended somebody in a genuine way. Maybe I've said something that's sinful. Maybe I have committed sin. Maybe I need to make something right. Okay. You don't have to get all defensive about it. You know, there are a lot of people that just can't take it. Is the criticism valid? Maybe it is. How many of you have heard Van Halen? Okay. Some of us are too old. Some of us are too young. Some of us know who I'm talking about. David Lee Roth, the singer of Van Halen, he once said, the only thing I'm allergic to is criticism. That's why he does his theatrics around the stage. He doesn't want anybody to criticize him. Well, Proverbs 9 and verse 8 says, do not correct a scoffer, lest he hate you. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love you. Do you know, the way you respond to criticism more often reveals more about you than it does about the critic. Can I say that again? The way you respond to criticism more often reveals more about you than it does about the critic. Let me read it again. Do not correct a scoffer lest he hate you. Somebody criticizes you, you respond by retaliating and fighting, getting mad, raising your voice, kicking over the pulpit, whatever. That says a lot about who you are. Rebuke a wise man and he will love you. How well do we take criticism? Something to think about. If you're a wise person, you know that it's dangerous to dismiss a rebuke just because you don't like it. Case in point, preacher says something up here you don't like. He touches on abortion, gay marriage, some other issue that you just don't like. Maybe somebody in your family might be guilty of something. You don't like it. Well, that preacher talks about stuff I don't like. He's putting them down. How do you respond to that? Rebuke a scoffer and he'll hate you. Rebuke a wise man and he will love you. Listen to what David says in Psalm 141 in verse 5. Let the righteous strike me, and it shall be a kindness. Let him rebuke me, and it shall be as precious oil. When's the last time you said something like that? Let the righteous strike me, it shall be a kindness. Let him rebuke me, it shall be as precious oil. Wow. That's great. I'll take whatever rebuke you have, and I'll consider you my best friend. Go ahead. Don't ever fear criticism when you're right, but don't ever ignore criticism when you're wrong. All right? Well, resist that defensive attitude, because criticism is the manure in which God's servants grow best. Amen? No, you don't believe that, do you? Well, you didn't have to put it that way, preacher. But it is. It is. That's right. You want something to grow well, that's the way to do it. That's right. How can you tell between constructive criticism and destructive criticism? Let me give you a few hints. Number one, when criticism is founded on facts and not simply opinions. If it's founded on facts, that's good criticism. Number two, when it's made to the person who is in error and not when it's made to other people behind your back. Number three, when it is motivated by love, when there's a sincere desire to correct. And number four, after the critic has removed the beam from their own eye. All right, so resist that defensive attitude. Don't try to retaliate, get back, and hey, you can expect a blessing from God too. Because you know what Jesus said? Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, verses 11 and 12, blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Once again, I ask you, who served God faithfully and escaped criticism? I will await your answer until Jesus comes. Find the man who escaped criticism as a faithful servant of God. They didn't. They didn't. So I believe the poet was right when he said, "Be not concerned nor be surprised if what you do is criticized. There are always folks who usually can find some fault with every plan. Mistakes are made, we can't deny, but only made by folks who try." How many of you have heard of the President Theodore Roosevelt? Okay, good old Teddy. Well, Teddy made this statement once. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how strong man stumbled, or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes up short again and again, who knows great enthusiasm, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat. So friend, let me just suggest to you as I close, if you try anything greatly, enthusiastically, or valiantly for the Lord, criticism is sure to come your way. And if it hasn't yet, it's right down the street. But do not be intimidated, do not be discouraged, because great is your reward in heaven. Don't shy away from doing the Lord's work if people criticize you. It is worth the effort. It is worth the toil. It is worth the work and the labor for the Lord. As long as you know you're doing your best in serving Christ, others will complain, others will criticize. Be honest, be sincere. Take criticism in a humble and sincere fashion. Apply it where it is needed, but leave the judgment up to God and do your best. Don't be weary in doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. You can cope with criticism. It doesn't have to beat you down. But if you're here this morning and you need to become a child of God by faith, this is your moment. This is your moment. This is your time to chart your eternal destiny. You can make a difference. Jesus Christ came to this world so that you can go to heaven. He left His place in heaven so that you can have your place in heaven. He came so that you can put your trust in Him. By faith, you can turn from your sins and you can be baptized into Christ for the forgiveness of all your sins, leaving your sins at the foot of the cross. You can become a new creation in Him. You can become a Christian today. We're here to help you do that. And if you need to make a decision to, as a member of this church or as a Christian who needs to come back to God, you can leave your sinful past behind, do business with the Lord. You can return to God. The Bible says if we confess our sins, God's faithful and just to forgive us of our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. That's a promise to God's children. You can come back to God today if you need to do business with Him and just say, Lord, I've messed up. I made that decision to become a Christian, but I need to come back to God today. You can do that too. But God is only going to deal with you for this next few moments while all things are in readiness. The moment you step out of this door, you're back in this world, and you know what? There's so many things that are going to cause you to forget all about this. You can come back to God anytime, but all things are in readiness now. And today is the day of salvation. Now's the accepted time, so why not now?